The cold Montana wind blew dust around the empty sale yard as Jake Miller counted the wrinkled dollar bills in his wallet one more time. $43. That was all he had left before losing everything. The bank had already sent him the last warning letter. He had 60 days to pay for 3 months of house payments he had missed, or the 800-acre farm that had belonged to his family for 4 generations would be taken away. At 42 years old, Jake looked like someone who had lived through very tough times. The farm outside Billings had been having problems for years, but the past 18 months had been terrible. The prices farmers got for cows had dropped a lot, just as the cost of animal food went way up. He had to sell most of his cows for less money than they were worth. Watching animals his family had raised for many years get taken away for almost no money. His wife, Sarah, had left 6 months ago, taking their daughter to live with her sister in Bozeman. She had stopped believing the farm could work long before she stopped believing in their marriage. Now, Jake came to the animal sale every Wednesday, not to buy anything, but just to watch. It was a painful habit that reminded him of everything he had lost. He sat on the old wooden benches as group after group of animals sold. Healthy cows, good horses, animals that people with money could buy. Each sale reminded him of the life that was going away. Lot 73, the sale announcer said, his voice not sounding as excited as usual. Quarter horse baby, about 4 months old. Mother is dead. Owner giving her up. Selling as she is. Jake looked up to see the saddest-looking horse he had ever seen being brought into the ring. The baby horse was so small, she barely came up to the worker's waist. Her coat was a muddy, dull color, covered with dried dirt and missing spots where a skin disease had hurt her. She was painfully skinny. Every rib bone could be seen, and her hip bones stuck out like coat hangers. One eye was crusty and closed from an infection, and she walked with a bad limp on her right front leg. She looked more dead than alive. The crowd reacted right away. People turned away. Some laughed. Others shook their heads in disgust that anyone would bring such a sad creature to the sale. Let's start the bidding at $20, the announcer tried. Silence. $10. Anyone give me $10. Nothing. People were already looking at their phones, waiting for the next animal. $5. The announcer's voice had gone flat. Folks, I've got to sell this baby horse. Give me $1. Still nothing. The worker stood in the ring looking embarrassed, holding the rope of a baby horse that swayed on her feet like she might fall down at any moment. All right, 50 cents, the announcer finally said. 50 cents, or she goes straight to be killed. Do I hear 50 cents? Something made Jake look at the baby horse more carefully. Despite how sick she was, maybe because of it, there was something in the way she held her head. Even sick and starving, even with one eye swollen shut, she wasn't giving up. She stood there with pride that seemed impossible, considering how she looked. And when her one good eye found Jake in the crowd, he felt a shock of connection he couldn't explain. His hand went up before he could think about it. 50 cents to the man in the back, the announcer said quickly, clearly happy to move on. Sold. As Jake walked down to get his purchase, he could feel people's eyes on him. People thought he was either crazy or mean for taking an animal that probably wouldn't live another week. And honestly, they were probably right. He had no money for a vet, barely enough food for his last 2 horses, and no good reason to take on another animal he couldn't afford to feed. But as he gently took the rope, and the tiny baby horse limped beside him toward his old pickup truck, Jake felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose beyond just trying to survive. Before we continue with Jake's amazing journey, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and make sure you hit that subscribe button. What happens next with this 50-cent baby horse will absolutely shock you. This is a story you won't believe until you see how it ends. Jake named her Penny both to describe her and as a promise. A promise that despite her rough start, she would grow into something more. Getting her home was difficult. She could barely walk to his truck and had trouble keeping her balance in the trailer. Jake drove 15 miles per hour the whole way back to the farm, scared that every bump in the road would be the one that finally hurt the fragile creature. His 2 remaining horses, an old male horse named Duke and a female horse named Daisy, who was too old for having babies, watched with mild interest as Jake settled Penny in the small barn. He used the last of his hay to make her a bed and gave her water in a shallow pan since she seemed too weak to lift her head to a bucket. That first night, Jake slept in the barn. He told himself it was to watch her condition, but the truth was simpler. The farmhouse felt too empty, too full of memories of Sarah and their daughter. At least in the barn, with the gentle sounds of horses breathing in the darkness, he didn't feel quite so alone. Penny survived the night, then another, then a week. Jake couldn't afford a vet, but he'd grown up on this farm and learned animal care from his grandfather. He cleaned her infected eye with warm salt water and treated the skin disease with a mixture of sulfur and lard, an old cowboy trick that actually worked. He fed her small amounts often, knowing her starved body couldn't handle much at once. He walked her gently around the pen twice a day, slowly building strength in that injured leg. The change took months, but it was amazing. By late fall, Penny's coat had grown out to show something unexpected. She was a beautiful blue roan color with a white stripe down her face and 3 white socks. The color pattern was striking, but it was her body shape that really caught Jake's attention as she got healthier. Despite her small size, she was perfectly built, with powerful back legs and a deep chest that suggested she came from good family lines. More interesting was her personality. Most horses that survived the kind of neglect Penny had gone through became either scared or mean. Penny was neither. She was curious, loving, and showed a confidence that seemed to be born in her rather than learned from experience. But what really set Penny apart showed up the day Jake turned her out with his 2 remaining cows. He'd kept a pair of cows, tough old mixed-breed animals that were too stubborn and mean to sell. They'd broken through 3 different fences that month, and Jake was running out of ideas for keeping them where they belonged. That morning, he'd opened the gate to move them to a different field, and as usual, they'd scattered in opposite directions, refusing to cooperate. Penny, now 8 months old and healthy, was eating grass nearby. As Jake ran after one of the cows, saying frustrated words under his breath, he noticed the young horse watching closely. Then, without any prompting or training, Penny began to move. She walked toward the cow with her head low, ears forward, moving with smoothness that seemed almost planned. When the cow tried to turn left, Penny was already there, blocking the move. When the cow tried to brake right, Penny matched the movement perfectly. Within 30 seconds, the young horse had moved the stubborn cow exactly where Jake wanted her, then immediately went after the second cow without being asked. Jake stood frozen, watching in amazement. He'd worked with cutting horses before, horses trained specifically to separate cattle from groups, but he'd never seen anything like this. Penny had no training whatsoever. She was working purely on instinct, and her instinct was better than horses he'd seen that had years of professional training. Over the next few weeks, Jake began testing Penny's abilities more carefully. Every time he needed to move the cows, he'd have Penny in the field. The young horse never failed to understand what was needed, moving with intelligence and anticipation that seemed almost magical. She could read a cow's body language before the animal itself knew which way it would turn. She had a natural sense of distance and timing that trainers spent years trying to teach. "That's the most amazing thing I've ever seen," said Marcus Chen, Jake's neighbor, watching Penny work one afternoon. Marcus ran a much larger farm and had several trained cutting horses. How long you been training her? I haven't, Jake admitted. She just knows. Marcus studied Penny more carefully. You said you got her at the sale. You know anything about her family line? Nothing. She came from a give-up group. No papers. Well, she's got to have cutting horse in her somewhere. That's not the kind of ability that just appears. Marcus paused. You ever thought about competing with her? The question seemed ridiculous. Jake barely had money for feed. Competition cutting horses were multi-million-dollar investments with family trees as long as your arm. They trained for years with professional riders and special facilities. The idea that his 50-cent rescue baby horse could compete in that world was laughable, but Marcus wouldn't let it go. Over the next month, he kept bringing it up, finally offering to pay for Jake's entry into a small regional cutting horse competition in Helena. Just to see what she can do, Marcus insisted. Entry fees on me. If she embarrasses herself, no harm done. But if she's got what I think she's got. Jake agreed, mostly because he had nothing left to lose. The competition was 3 months away, giving him time to work with Penny every day. But work was hardly the right word. Penny didn't need training in the normal sense. She needed practice and physical conditioning, but her understanding of cattle work was already more advanced than anything Jake could have taught her. The Helena competition was small, maybe 40 entries, mostly local ranchers and semi-professional trainers. Jake felt completely out of place, pulling up in his rusty pickup, while other competitors arrived in fancy trailers worth more than his farm. Penny looked healthy now, even beautiful, but she was still small for her age and didn't have the polish of horses that spent their lives in show barns. When their turn came, Jake rode Penny into the arena with butterflies in his stomach. The format was simple. They'd have 2.5 minutes to separate cows from a small group and show Penny's ability to prevent them from returning to the herd. What happened next shocked everyone there. Penny exploded into action with precision and intensity that made the judges sit up in their seats. She read the cattle like she could see the future, knowing every move before it happened. Her turns were so sharp and low that Jake struggled to stay balanced in the saddle. She worked with an intensity that seemed almost supernatural. This wasn't a trained behavior. This was a calling. When their time ended, the arena went silent for a moment before erupting in clapping. Jake had never competed before and barely knew if they'd done well, but the looks on people's faces told him something extraordinary had just happened. Penny won the competition, not just won. She dominated with a score that would have been impressive at a national event, let alone a regional one. Afterward, Jake was surrounded by trainers, breeders, and competitors asking about Penny's bloodline, her training program, whether she was for sale. One man offered him $50,000 on the spot. Another offered $75,000. A woman from a major breeding program in Idaho pulled Jake aside and said, I don't know where you found her, but that horse has the best natural cutting instinct I've seen in 30 years. Whatever you do, don't sell her cheap. Jake drove home that night in a daze, a first-place trophy on the seat beside him, and a check for $5,000 in prize money, more cash than he'd seen in 2 years. But more than the money, he felt something else. Validation. Maybe he wasn't crazy. Maybe this 50-cent baby horse that nobody wanted was actually something special. Over the next year, Penny became a sensation in the cutting horse world. At every competition, regional, state, and eventually national events, she dominated. By the time she was 3 years old, she'd won over $200,000 in prize money and attracted attention from the biggest names in the sport. But the real money came from breeding rights and business opportunities that came from Penny's success. Breeding offers started at $100,000 per baby horse and quickly went up. Everyone wanted offspring from the horse with the most natural cutting ability anyone had ever seen. Jake was careful and selective, working with veterinarians and scientists to create a sustainable breeding program. Penny's first baby sold for $400,000. The second went for $650,000. More significantly, Jake's success with Penny attracted people who wanted to learn his training methods. He tried to explain that he hadn't really trained her. She was just naturally gifted, but people insisted there must be something he was doing right. They were willing to pay large fees for training classes and advice. This led Jake to a realization. While Penny's ability was exceptional, his approach to working with her, respecting her instincts, allowing her natural talents to guide the training rather than forcing strict methods, could be used more broadly. He began developing a training philosophy based on observation and partnership rather than domination. The Miller method became sought after across the cutting horse world. Jake wrote a book, started a YouTube channel, and eventually opened a training facility on his farm that attracted clients from across the country. People paid $10,000 per month to have their horses trained using his approach, and there was a waiting list 2 years long. But the most shocking discovery came when Penny was 4 years old. A veterinarian examining her for breeding purposes noticed something unusual in her body structure and suggested a genetic test. The results showed that Penny was a direct descendant of Dakbar, one of the most legendary cutting horses in history, whose bloodline was thought to have disappeared decades ago through a specific branch of the family tree. This revelation sent shock waves through the quarter horse breeding world. Penny wasn't just naturally talented. She carried genetics from one of the foundation horses of modern cutting horses, genetics that breeders had thought were lost forever. Her value skyrocketed overnight. Breeding offers reached 7 figures. A group of breeders offered Jake $5 million for 50% ownership, which he accepted while keeping control over her care and breeding decisions. Her babies were selling for over $1 million each before they were even born, with waiting lists of buyers hoping to access the rediscovered bloodline. 5 years after buying a dying baby horse for 50 cents, Jake Miller was worth over $40 million. The farm was transformed. He'd paid off the house loan within a year of Penny's first major win. Now he'd expanded it to 2,000 acres with state-of-the-art training facilities, climate-controlled barns, and a staff of 15. The Miller Training Center was one of the best cutting horse facilities in the country, with a client list that included celebrities, professional athletes, and wealthy ranchers from around the world. But perhaps more importantly, Jake had gotten back together with Sarah. She'd followed Penny's success in the news, and one day she'd called carefully, asking if she and their daughter could visit the farm. That visit had led to long conversations about what had gone wrong and whether they could find their way back to each other. They'd remarried a year later, and Sarah had been important in building the business side of Jake's empire, bringing organizational skills and business smarts that matched his horsemanship. One evening, 6 years after that dusty sale, Jake stood in Penny's beautiful stall at the training center. The female horse, who'd once been hours from death, now lived in comfort that would make most humans jealous. She'd just had her third baby, another female that already showed signs of her mother's exceptional talent. "You know what's wild?" Jake said to Sarah, who'd come out to check on the new baby. "If even one other person at that sale had bid 50 cents, none of this would have happened. I barely had enough to cover the sale fee, but no one else saw what you saw," Sarah replied, wrapping an arm around his waist. "I didn't see anything," Jake admitted. "I just felt something, like she was meant to be here." Penny made a soft sound, pressing her forehead against Jake's chest in a gesture of affection that had become their nightly habit. Despite the success, the wealth, the fame, she was still just a horse who remembered the man who'd given her a chance when no one else would. "Best 50 cents anyone ever spent," Sarah said, scratching behind Penny's ears. "Best 50 cents anyone could spend," Jake corrected. She didn't just save the farm. She saved me. The cutting horse world had been transformed by Penny's influence. Her offspring were winning competitions across the country. The Miller method had become standard teaching at major training facilities, and the rediscovered bloodline had brought new life to breeding programs that had been stuck for decades. But for Jake, standing in that barn with his wife and the horse that had changed everything, the real wealth wasn't measured in dollars or trophies. It was measured in second chances. The chance Penny got to survive, the chance he got to save his family's legacy, and the chance both of them got to prove that worth isn't determined by price tags or first impressions. A baby horse that nobody wanted for 50 cents had become the foundation of a multi-million-dollar empire. But more than that, she'd become proof that sometimes the most valuable things in life are the ones everyone else overlooks. If this story moved you, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell so you never miss another incredible story. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that every ending can become a new beginning, and that sometimes the smallest investments give the most amazing returns. Drop a comment telling us about a time when you took a chance on something or someone that everyone else had given up on. And remember, just like Jake and Penny showed us, the things we rescue often end up rescuing us right back. Sometimes all it takes is 50 cents and the courage to believe when no one else will. Thanks for watching.